Huddled on a cold plastic mattress in a police holding cell, its single grime-streaked window set too high to offer escape, a young woman faces despair, her mind lost in fears for her vulnerable loved one. Suddenly, urgent voices outside speak of a massive fire engulfing the very pharmacy that sealed her fate. Shortly after, the heavy cell door clangs open. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark, tailored suit that seems to absorb the light, his sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing and holding an unnerving stillness, stands there. He has paid her bail in cash, his motives entirely unclear, his calm demeanor unsettling. Why has this powerful stranger intervened with such dramatic, destructive timing, and what price will his mysterious salvation demand? Like the video and subscribe to the channel to catch more thrilling, emotional stories. Hit the bell and join our journey. The air in Good Health Pharmacy always tasted stale. A curious blend of old linoleum, sharp disinfectants and something else. A metallic tang that Ellie Moreau had come to associate with desperation. Tonight, the desperation was her own, coiling in her stomach like a cold serpent. Oakhaven Creek, a town clinging to the muddy banks of the wide, listless river, was good at brewing that particular flavor of despair. Once a place of modest bustle, its historic brick buildings now stood as weary sentinels of decline, some gentrified into quaint, expensive islands in a sea of forgotten storefronts, others simply surrendering to decay. Late on this damp October evening, the pharmacy was an oasis of harsh fluorescent light in the dimly lit pharmacy district, a street that mostly offered pawn shops and the ghosts of businesses past. Ellie's gaze darted from the pimply-faced junior pharmacist, engrossed in his phone behind the counter, to the small, unassuming bottle in her hand, Atelior, the medication her younger brother, Finn, needed to breathe without his chest constricting in a terrifying, vice-like grip. The price tag was a cruel joke, more than her last 2 paychecks combined from the diner where she worked. Each pill was a tiny, impossible mountain. Fear, cold and sharp, had driven her here. Finn's last refill was gone. The wheezing had started again that afternoon, a faint, reedy sound that tore at Ellie's heart. She'd tried everything. Payment plans the pharmacy chain rejected, charities with endless waiting lists, even the whispered advice of her pragmatic neighbor, Rona, about less than legal avenues she hadn't dared explore until now. The gnawing dread of listening to Finn struggle for air, of seeing the panic in his 10-year-old eyes, had finally snapped something within her. Her hand, calloused from scrubbing tables and washing dishes, trembled as she palmed the bottle. Her worn canvas jacket, thin against the evening's chill, felt like a flimsy shield. She took a shallow breath, trying to steady her racing heart, and made a move towards the exit, feigning interest in a display of discount vitamins. "Can I help you with something, miss?" The voice, no longer the indifferent tone of the junior but the sharper, more practiced cadence of Mr. Henderson, the senior pharmacist and owner, cut through the silence. Ellie froze, her back to him. She could feel his eyes on her, dissecting her faded jeans, her patched sneakers, her undeniable aura of need. Slowly she turned. Mr. Henderson was a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, his neatly parted grey hair and crisp white coat a stark contrast to the weary air of his establishment. He was looking pointedly at the slight bulge in her jacket pocket. "No, thank you," Ellie managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Just looking." "Looking at what exactly?" He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because it looked like you were about to walk out with unpaid merchandise." Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. Her face burned. The metallic tang in the air seemed to intensify, mixed now with the faint, cloying scent of the cheap air freshener puffing from a dispenser near the door. I wasn't... Empty your pockets, please." His voice was calm but firm, the voice of a man who had dealt with shoplifters before, who perhaps even relished the small power it afforded him in his struggling business. Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes. The small bottle felt like a lead weight in her pocket. She could hear the hum of the refrigerators, the distant splash of rain against the grimy windows, the frantic thumping of her own heart. There was no escape. With a shaking hand, she pulled out the Atelier. Mr. Henderson's expression hardened. "Thought so. Stealing vital medication. You know how serious that is?" He reached for the phone on the counter. I'm calling the police. Please, Ellie choked out, the word raw with anguish. My brother, he's sick, he needs it, I can't afford it. That's not my problem, is it? He said, dialing. It's theft, plain and simple. The next hour was a blur of mortification. The arrival of the Oakhaven Creek police, their movements efficient and impersonal. The brief, hushed questions. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs around her wrists, the chill seeping into her bones. She was vaguely aware of the junior pharmacist watching with wide, scared eyes, and Mr. Henderson's self-righteous pronouncements about law and order. At the police station, the fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting harsh shadows on the drab green walls of the booking room. The air was thick with the sickly sweet smell of another cheap air freshener, failing to mask the underlying scent of stale coffee, sweat, and old fear. Each sound echoed unnaturally. The clang of a distant cell door, the murmur of voices, the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of a keyboard. Ellie sat on a hard plastic chair, the small bottle of Atelier now evidence lying on the sergeant's desk. Her face was a mask of shame and terror, her earlier desperation now curdled into a profound sense of failure. She hadn't just failed to get the medicine, she had made everything infinitely worse. What would happen to Finn now? The thought was an unbearable weight, pressing down on her, threatening to crush what little resilience she had left. The cold of the handcuffs seemed to creep up her arms, a chilling premonition of the future she had just sealed for herself. Ellie sat huddled on the thin, plastic-covered mattress in the holding cell, the cold seeping through her thin jacket. The single, grime-streaked window was set too high to see anything but a sliver of the dark, rain-swept sky. Hours had passed, each one stretching into an eternity of self-recrimination and mounting panic. Finn. What would happen to Finn? Their small rented apartment was already under threat of eviction. Her meager savings were non-existent. There was no one else. The image of his small, trusting face, the sound of his increasingly labored breathing, played on a torturous loop in her mind. She imagined social services, foster care, Finn alone and terrified. The shame of her arrest was a burning coal in her chest, but it was the fear for her brother that truly consumed her. A sudden commotion outside her cell door startled her. Raised voices, the crackle of a police radio, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. Ellie pressed her ear to the cold steel, straining to hear. Words like fire, massive, pharmacy district drifted through. Her heart lurched. The Good Health Pharmacy? It couldn't be. But the murmurings grew, confirming the unbelievable. The Good Health Pharmacy was engulfed in flames. A massive fire, the officers said, out of control. Ellie's mind reeled. The place she'd been arrested, the source of her current nightmare, was burning. It felt unreal, like a scene from a twisted dream. Was Mr. Henderson okay? The junior pharmacist? Despite everything, a sliver of concern for them pierced through her own fog of misery. Not long after the news of the fire began to circulate through the station, perhaps an hour or so, the heavy clang of the cell door unlocking echoed down the short corridor. An officer, a woman with tired eyes and a weary set to her mouth, stood there. "Moreau, someone's posted your bail." Ellie stared, uncomprehending. Bail? Who? Rona barely had enough to cover her own bills. There was no one else. Bail? But who would... The officer just shrugged. Don't know, don't care. Rich guy, apparently, paid in cash. You're free to go for now. Numbly, Ellie followed the officer back to the booking area. Her meager belongings, her worn wallet with its few dollars, her keys, a cheap comb, were handed back to her in a plastic bag. And then she saw him. He stood near the exit, partially cloaked in the shadows that the station's harsh lighting couldn't quite dispel. Tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, he exuded an aura of quiet power and immense wealth. His features were sharp, almost classical, his dark hair swept back from a high forehead. His eyes, though, were what held her captive. They were intelligent, piercing, and held an unnerving stillness, as if he'd seen centuries pass and found little to surprise him. He looked to be in his early 40s, yet there was an ageless quality about him. This was Orion Valerius. He inclined his head slightly as she approached, a gesture that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, merely acknowledging. Eliza Moreau, I presume. His voice was deep, resonant, with a subtle cadence that hinted at an old-world formality, smooth as expensive velvet. Yes, Ellie managed, her voice hoarse. She clutched her plastic bag of belongings, feeling small and utterly bewildered. You paid my bail? I did, he confirmed, his expression unreadable. You are free to leave. But why? I don't understand. Who are you? The questions tumbled out, fueled by confusion and a dawning, inexplicable fear. This man, his sudden appearance, the news of the fire, it was too much, too strange. Orion Valerius simply regarded her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. My reasons are my own. The pharmacy fire, I understand, is quite spectacular, a tragedy for Mr. Henderson, no doubt. There was no discernible emotion in his voice as he said this, no hint of sympathy or satisfaction. You should go home to your brother. He knew about Finn. The realization sent a fresh jolt of unease through her. How could he possibly know about Finn? She hadn't mentioned her brother to anyone but the arresting officer, and then only in a desperate, unheard plea. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Orion offered no explanation. He merely turned and walked towards the station exit, the automatic doors sighing open before him as if by command. He paused at the threshold, looking out into the rainy Oakhaven Creek night. I will be in touch, Miss Moreau. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness as silently and mysteriously as he had appeared. Ellie stood frozen, the sickly sweet air of the police station suddenly feeling even more suffocating. Her bail was paid. The pharmacy was burning. A wealthy, enigmatic stranger had intervened, his motives a complete mystery. She was free, but a new, far more complex web of questions and anxieties was beginning to spin around her. The immediate, desperate need for Finn's medication resurfaced with a vengeance. The Good Health Pharmacy, the only local supplier of Atelier, was a pile of smouldering ruins, and she, Eliza Moreau, was now linked not only to a theft, but also, by virtue of her timely release and the benefactor who had secured it, to a highly suspicious arson. The rain had eased to a persistent drizzle by the time Ellie reached her small second-floor apartment in a rundown building on the other side of the river. The journey home had been a torment of conflicting emotions. Relief at being out of the cell warred with a profound unease about Orion Valerius. His unnerving presence, his calm assertion that he would be in touch, felt less like a promise and more like a subtle threat. And the fire. How could she not connect his sudden appearance and her release with the pharmacy's destruction? The thought that he might have burned it down for her was terrifying. It was a violent, destructive act, and if he was capable of that for a stranger, what else was he capable of? Finn was asleep in his small bed, his breathing shallow but for the moment even. A wave of love, so fierce it was painful, washed over Ellie as she gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. The fear for him was a constant ache. Now, with the pharmacy gone and the police likely to be scrutinizing her every move, securing his Atelier felt more impossible than ever. The next morning brought Detective Lena Hansen to her door. Hansen was in her late 30s, with sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing and a no-nonsense demeanor that Ellie found instantly intimidating. She wasn't in uniform, but her crisp blazer and the set of her jaw radiated authority. Miss Moreau, Hansen began, her tone polite but firm, after Ellie had reluctantly let her in. The tiny apartment felt even smaller with the detective's presence. I'm investigating the theft at Good Health Pharmacy last night, and, as you might imagine, the subsequent arson. Ellie perched on the edge of her worn sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I already told the officers everything about the theft. I'm sure you did, Hansen said, her gaze sweeping the room, lingering for a moment on the framed photo of a smiling Finn on the small side table. But things have become a bit more complicated, wouldn't you say? Pharmacy burns down hours after you're arrested for stealing from it. Then a mysterious benefactor, Mr. Orion Valerius, pays your hefty bail in cash. That's quite a coincidence. Ellie's stomach tightened. I don't know anything about the fire, and Mr. Valerius, I'd never met him before last night. I have no idea why he helped me. It was the truth, but it sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. Mr. Valerius is a very wealthy, very private individual, Hansen continued, her eyes fixing on Ellie. He owns the old rookery estate up on the bluff, not exactly the sort to concern himself with petty theft cases in Oakhaven Creek, unless he had a particular interest. Ellie felt a flush creep up her neck. I wouldn't know. Right. Hansen tapped a pen against her notepad. The fire investigators found something interesting at the pharmacy. Traces of a highly effective accelerant, very professional job. Not your typical disgruntled kid with a can of gasoline. This was planned. The question is, by whom and why? The detective's questions hung in the air, each one a barb catching Ellie. She was the primary link, the focal point where the theft and the arson converged. Hansen's suspicion was palpable. We'll also be looking into the pharmacy's business practices, Hansen added almost as an aside. There have been murmurs about Mr. Henderson before, price gouging, that sort of thing. Perhaps someone had a bigger grudge than just an inability to pay for overpriced pills. This was narrative hook 4. The original reason the meds were so expensive or hard to obtain hints at a larger corruption the vampire might be aware of. Ellie's mind latched onto that. If Henderson was corrupt, did that somehow make Orion's act less monstrous? The moral gymnastics were exhausting. After Hansen left, promising to be in touch, Ellie sank onto the sofa, her head in her hands. She was trapped. The police suspected her, or at least suspected a connection to someone dangerous. And she still had no atelier for Finn. His current reprieve was temporary. He needed his next dose soon. A few days later, a sleek black car, utterly out of place in her decaying neighborhood, purred to a stop outside her building. A chauffeur, as impeccably dressed as Orion himself, hand-delivered a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside, Ellie found a new, unopened box of atelier and a small, stiff card with a handwritten note. For Finn. He should be seen by a specialist. An appointment has been arranged. Details will follow. OV. Tender moment 1. The vampire arranging for a discreet, high-quality medical assessment and a supply of the needed medication for the protagonist's loved one, without any strings overtly attached. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, tears of relief, confusion, and a burgeoning wary gratitude. He had known Finn's name, he knew what medication he needed, and now he was arranging specialist care, something Ellie could only dream of. But the unease remained. Why was he doing this? What did he want in return? The appointment was at a private clinic in a neighboring, more affluent city. The doctor was kind, thorough, and prescribed a slightly adjusted, more effective treatment plan for Finn, the initial supply of which was, again, mysteriously covered. Ellie felt like she was living in a surreal dream, her mundane struggles suddenly intersected by an otherworldly benefactor whose motives remained shrouded in shadow. Orion Valerius summoned her to the rookery a week later. The chauffeur appeared again, this time to drive her. The manor was as Detective Hansen had described, a magnificent, isolated Gothic revival edifice perched on a wooded bluff overlooking the mist-shrouded Oakhaven Creek. Its dark stone seemed to absorb the fading daylight, giving it a brooding, watchful presence. Inside, it was a labyrinth of shadowy rooms, filled with antique books, historical artifacts, and an almost oppressive silence, broken only by the distant murmur of the river and the sigh of the wind through the ancient trees. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, decaying paper, and something else, something cold and ancient. Orgen received her in a vast library, shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes that reached to the high, vaulted ceiling. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on his face. He was dressed in dark, casual clothes, yet still retained that air of innate formality and power. "Miss Moreau," he said, gesturing to a deep leather armchair. "Please." Ellie sat, feeling dwarfed by the scale of the room and the intensity of his gaze. "Mr. Valerius, I don't know how to thank you. For the medicine, for Finn's appointment." "It was a small matter," he replied, his voice smooth and devoid of inflection. He moved to a heavy oak desk, his back to her for a moment, as he looked out of a tall, arched window at the darkening river valley. Oakhaven Creek is a town that often disappoints. "Disappoints?" He turned back, his eyes glinting in the firelight. It preys on the vulnerable. Men like Henderson who profit from desperation are a symptom of a deeper malaise. This was a hint of narrative hook 1. Why did the vampire choose such a destructive method to help a stranger? Was it purely about erasing the crime, or was there more to the pharmacy itself? Ellie found her voice a tremor in it despite her efforts to remain calm. Did you burn down the pharmacy, Mr. Valerius?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked slowly towards a section of shelves that seemed out of place, filled not with ancient tomes, but with meticulously organized medical journals and historical texts on pharmacology and healing. Narrative Hook 3. The protagonist discovers the vampire has a hidden collection or interest related to medical history or alleviating suffering. "In my considerable experience," he said, trailing a long finger along the spine of a particularly old-looking volume, "I have seen suffering in many forms, and I have seen greed exacerbate it time and again. Sometimes a diseased limb must be cauterized to save the body." His words sent a chill down her spine. Cauterized. It was a clinical, detached way to describe such a violent act. Yet there was a strange logic to it, a ruthless pragmatism that was both terrifying and, in a disturbing way, understandable, given her own recent desperation. Henderson was overcharging, yes, Ellie said, her voice small, but arson? Orion finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. The Good Health Pharmacy, Miss Moreau, was more than just a purveyor of overpriced medication. It was a conduit for diluted and sometimes counterfeit drugs, particularly those destined for the most desperate, those who couldn't afford to question the efficacy of what kept them or their loved ones alive. Mr. Henderson was a small cog in a larger, more venal machine. Twist 1. The pharmacy was a front. Ellie stared at him, stunned. Counterfeit drugs? This changed everything. If true, then the fire wasn't just about her or about erasing her crime. It was about something much bigger, much darker. How do you know this? "I make it my business to know such things," he stated simply. He then moved the conversation almost seamlessly to a different topic. "I understand you are facing eviction." Ellie flinched. "How?" "It is of no consequence how I know. The matter has been addressed." He gestured vaguely. "Consider your tenancy secure for the foreseeable future." Tender moment 3. The vampire subtly using his resources to alleviate another pressing, unrelated problem for the protagonist, showing a broader concern. Overwhelmed, Ellie could only stammer her thanks. He was a whirlwind of contradictions, a destroyer and a savior, terrifyingly remote, yet capable of such targeted, almost gentle acts of assistance. During that first extended conversation at the rookery, and in a few subsequent carefully orchestrated meetings, Orion began to subtly reveal slivers of his past. He never spoke directly of being a vampire, of course, or of his true age, but he hinted at witnessing centuries of human folly, of injustices that echoed through time. He spoke of times when plagues swept through cities and charlatans sold useless tinctures to the dying, of wars where the wounded were left to suffer because their care was deemed too costly. Revelation, vampires past, through guarded conversations. The vampire hints at a past where he witnessed similar injustices or the devastating effects of greed, particularly in matters of life and death, shaping his extreme and decisive actions. One evening, as a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within Ellie, she found herself hesitantly explaining the full depth of her desperation leading up to the theft. The sleepless nights, the crushing weight of responsibility for Finn, the feeling of being utterly alone against an uncaring system. Tender moment 2, a shared quiet moment where the protagonist hesitantly explains her desperation and the vampire listens with an unexpected depth of understanding, perhaps sharing a vague, ancient sorrow. Orion listened, his usual unnerving stillness somehow transformed into a profound, patient attention. When she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears, he merely nodded, a shadow of an ancient sorrow in his eyes. "The desperation of a protector," he murmured more to himself than to her, "is a powerful and often underestimated force." Meanwhile, Detective Hansen was not idle. She was a dog with a bone, her investigation into the pharmacy fire and Ellie's connection to Orion Valerius steadily progressing. She'd spoken to Rona Singh, Ellie's neighbor and co-worker at the diner. Rona, cynical but fiercely loyal to Ellie in her own way, had offered little concrete information but had unintentionally confirmed Ellie's desperation regarding Finn's illness. "Ellie's a good kid, Detective," Rona had said, wiping down the diner counter. "Works herself to the bone for that boy. That pharmacy was bleeding her dry. We all knew Henderson was a crook, one way or another." Hansen had also revisited the fire scene multiple times. One afternoon, sifting through the charred debris with a forensic team, she found something that didn't quite fit. Narrative Hook 2. The detective uncovers a piece of evidence from the pharmacy fire that doesn't quite add up, pointing to a more complex scenario. It was a small, partially melted data chip, lodged deep within the wreckage of what used to be Henderson's back office, an office that, according to the initial sweep, contained only paper records. This chip suggested a more sophisticated record-keeping system than a small-town pharmacist like Henderson would seemingly need. Hansen's instincts, already on high alert regarding Valerius, sharpened. She learned of his discreet inquiries into Finn's medical care, his anonymous payment of Ellie's overdue rent. These weren't the actions of a disinterested stranger. These were the actions of someone investing, someone with a purpose. She also discovered through Old Town records and archived newspaper articles that the Valerius family, or at least the name, had been associated with the rookery for generations, always wealthy, always reclusive, always with a hint of something unusual about them. There were whispers, local legends really, about their longevity, their aversion to daylight, but she dismissed those as small-town folklore. The wealth and influence, however, were very real. Her investigation also led her to look deeper into Mr. Silas Croft, the benign owner of the Good Health Pharmacy. The optional antagonist in the briefing, but now a key player. She found that Croft wasn't just the owner of one struggling pharmacy. He had a small, almost invisible chain of them in similarly depressed towns across the state. And there were whispers, formal complaints even, that had been dismissed or buried about the quality of medications, particularly specialized, expensive ones, at his other establishments. Twist 1 was starting to gain traction in Hansen's mind too, though she didn't yet know the half of it, or Orion's specific role in its fiery demise. Hansen decided to apply more pressure. She started by subtly increasing surveillance on Ellie, making her presence known, hoping to rattle her or force Valerius's hand. She also began digging into Valerius's legitimate business holdings, looking for any irregularity, any leverage. She knew confronting a man like Orion Valerius directly, without concrete proof, would be futile. He was too powerful, too insulated. One particularly bleak November afternoon, Detective Hansen made an unannounced visit to the rookery. She hadn't called ahead, deliberately seeking to catch Orion off guard, a tactic she doubted would work, but felt compelled to try. The massive iron gates were surprisingly open. As she drove up the winding, tree-lined drive, the manor loomed, its dark windows like eyes watching her approach. She felt a prickle of unease, a rare sensation for the usually unflappable detective. She had a feeling that Mr. Valerius was expecting her. This visit wasn't just about Ellie anymore. It was about the suspicious fire, the data chip, and the shadowy figure of Orion Valerius himself. She was beginning to suspect that the pharmacy fire had not been a simple act of vigilante justice for one desperate girl, but perhaps the silencing of a much larger, more dangerous operation, and Valerius was somehow at the heart of it. Twist 2, Detective Hansen's personal stake, began to subtly influence her drive. Years ago, her own younger sister had suffered greatly due to diluted chemotherapy drugs, a case that was eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence against a powerful pharmaceutical distributor. The memory still fueled a cold anger in her, a relentless desire to see justice done for those exploited by medical greed. This case, with its whispers of counterfeit medication and a wealthy, untouchable figure, felt chillingly familiar. It wasn't just professional anymore. It was becoming deeply personal. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Detective Hansen's investigation was like a slowly tightening noose. Her frequent, pointed questions to Ellie, her not-so-subtle surveillance, and her inquiries around Oakhaven Creek about Orion Valerius were making Ellie increasingly anxious. The The townsfolk, initially sympathetic to Ellie's plight, were now wary, their whispers following her like shadows. Rona tried her best to shield her at the diner, but even her gruff support couldn't entirely deflect the suspicion. Simultaneously, the threat to Finn escalated in an unexpected way. The new medication procured through Orion's intervention was working wonders. Finn was more energetic, his laughter echoing through their small apartment more frequently. But their supply was finite. The specialist had prescribed a long-term course, and while Orion had covered the initial batch, the problem of ongoing access remained. Ellie had tried to make arrangements with the specialist's clinic for the next refill, only to be met with a sudden, inexplicable roadblock. The clinic secretary, usually so helpful, became evasive, murmuring about supply chain issues and unexpected shortages of that specific formulation. Ellie suspected this was no coincidence. Could Mr. Silas Croft, the owner of the destroyed Good Health Pharmacy, and, according to Orion, a purveyor of counterfeit drugs, be involved? Was he, or the larger network Orion had hinted at, somehow leveraging the medication supply to pressure her, or by extension, Orion? The thought that Finn's health was being used as a pawn in this dangerous game filled Ellie with a cold fury that momentarily eclipsed her fear. This was the escalation of the original threat, the source of the corrupt medication supply chain feeling threatened. Orion summoned Ellie to the rookery again. The urgency in his chauffeur's demeanor was palpable. When she arrived, the atmosphere in the manor was heavier, more charged than before. Orion wasn't in the library. He was in a less formal study, maps of Oakhaven Creek and its surrounding areas spread across a large table, some marked with cryptic symbols. He looked troubled, a rare crack in his usually imperturbable facade. "Detective Hansen is becoming excessively tenacious," Orion stated, his voice a low rumble. "She has found financial irregularities connected to Mr. Croft's other pharmacies, irregularities that point to a much larger network involved in the distribution of substandard and counterfeit medications. She believes the fire at Good Health was meant to destroy evidence of this network, and she sees you, and by extension me, as either responsible or knowledgeable." "And the medication for Finn," Ellie said, her voice tight. "The clinic suddenly can't get it. Is that Croft? Is he trying to bargain?" Orion's eyes, usually so cool, seemed to hold a flicker of something ancient and dangerous. "Croft is a desperate man, and desperate men are predictable. He, or rather his associates, are indeed attempting to apply pressure. They believe I have something they want, perhaps information, perhaps merely a desire for me to cease my interference." Just then, the distinct sound of a car engine, too powerful for the local Oakhaven Creek police cruisers, echoed up the long driveway. Orion glanced towards the window, his expression hardening. It seems Detective Hansen has decided to escalate matters as well. And she is not alone. Headlights swept across the manicured lawns. It was Hansen, but with her were two stern-faced men in dark suits Ellie didn't recognize. State investigators, perhaps, or something more federal, drawn by the widening scope of the counterfeit drug ring Hansen was uncovering. "They cannot know of my true nature, Ellie," Orion said, his voice low and urgent. "Your arrest, the fire, it must all appear to be the work of human hands, however extreme." The confrontation was imminent. It would happen here in the heart of Orion's sanctuary. Detective Hansen, flanked by the two stone-faced investigators, was met at the grand oak door not by a servant, but by Orion Valerius himself. He was the epitome of calm, aristocratic displeasure at the intrusion. "Detective Hansen," he greeted, his voice cool, "and associates, to what do I owe this unannounced visit at such an hour?" "Mr. Valerius," Hansen began, undeterred by his imposing presence, "we have more questions about the Good Health Pharmacy fire and your timely intervention in Miss Moreau's legal troubles. We also have evidence suggesting that pharmacy was a hub for distributing counterfeit medications, part of a network run by Silas Croft and others. A network that seems to have been significantly disrupted by that fire." Ellie, who had followed Orion to the hallway, felt her heart pound. This was it. "Indeed." Orion raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "A fascinating theory, Detective. And how precisely does this involve me or Miss Moreau, beyond her unfortunate lapse in judgment?" Hansen's eyes narrowed. We believe the arson was a professional job, designed to eradicate records that would expose Croft, perhaps by a rival faction, or perhaps by someone who wanted to silence him for other reasons. Your sudden interest in Miss Moreau, your payment of her bail, your subsequent assistance, it's highly coincidental. One of the investigators stepped forward. Mr. Valerius, we have information suggesting Mr. Croft is currently missing. He was last seen arguing with individuals known to have unorthodox methods of dispute resolution. We have reason to believe his disappearance is linked to the pharmacy fire and the exposure of his operation. This was new information. Croft missing? The situation was spiraling. It was then that Ellie, fueled by a desperate surge of courage and a flash of insight, stepped forward. Her mind raced, piecing together snippets of conversations she'd overheard at the diner, gossip from Rona about the shadier elements of Oakhaven Creek, and Orion's earlier comment about Croft being a small cog. "Detective," Ellie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Henderson at the Good Health Pharmacy, he wasn't just overcharging. He was always scared. He owed money, big money, to people from out of town, not just local loan sharks. He once told Rona, my friend at the diner, that he was in over his head with investors who weren't happy with his returns." Hanson turned to her, surprised by her interjection. "And you know this how, Miss Moreau?" "Oakhaven Creek is a small town, detective," Ellie continued, gaining confidence. "People talk. Henderson wasn't smart enough to run a counterfeit drug ring on his own. He was a pawn, terrified of his bosses. Maybe the fire wasn't about destroying records Croft kept, but records kept on Croft by these out-of-town people. Maybe they were cleaning house, getting rid of a liability. Mr. Henderson always said the pharmacy was his anchor, but it felt more like it was dragging him down." Ellie was drawing on her unique perspective of the town's undercurrents, offering a plausible alternative theory, one that painted Henderson, and by extension Croft, not as masterminds, but as expendable foot soldiers in a larger game, potentially targeted by their own dangerous associates. This could misdirect the investigators from focusing solely on Orion as the architect of the fire. It validated, in a complex way, Orion's extreme act by suggesting the pharmacy was already a site of dangerous criminal activity that was bound to implode. Hanson considered Ellie's words, her sharp gaze flicking between Ellie and Orion. Ellie's theory had a ring of truth, the kind of messy, desperate truth that often lurked beneath the surface in towns like Oakhaven Creek. It complicated the narrative, suggesting other players, other motives for the fire beyond Valerius's intervention. Narrative hook 2 could even fit this. Perhaps it belonged to these investors. Orion watched Ellie, a flicker of something unreadable, respect, surprise in his ancient eyes. He remained silent, allowing her words to shift the focus. Then, as if on cue, Detective Hanson's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression shifting. "We just got a report," she said slowly, looking at the investigators, then back at Orion. "Silas Croft's car has been found abandoned by the old river docks, and there's evidence suggesting he didn't leave willingly, and it doesn't point towards this address." The tension in the hallway didn't dissipate, but its direction shifted. The immediate suspicion on Orion as the sole orchestrator of the fire and Croft's disappearance now had competing theories. "It seems, Detective," Orion said, his voice still calm but with an underlying edge, "that Oakhaven Creek's problems run deeper and are far more mundane in their brutality than you might have imagined. Perhaps you are looking for criminals among criminals." Hanson held his gaze for a long moment. She wasn't entirely convinced, but Ellie's intervention had provided a crucial distraction, a plausible alternative that couldn't be easily dismissed. The new evidence regarding Croft's car also pointed away from the rookery. "We'll be looking into these investors, Miss Moreau," Hanson said, her tone clipped. "But this isn't over, Mr. Valerius. Not by a long shot." She and the investigators withdrew, the threat still lingering, but the immediate crisis in the hallway had passed. Once they were gone, a heavy silence descended. Ellie finally let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Orion turned to her, and for the first time she saw a genuine vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the ancient sorrow he usually kept so well hidden. "My reasons for acting as I did. They are not just about abstract justice, Ellie," he said, his voice softer now. "Long ago I lost someone someone I cared for deeply. She died because the medicine she needed was unobtainable, hoarded by men who valued profit above life. I watched her fade, helpless. The rage, the futility of it, it never truly leaves you. This was the emotional revelation. The vampire reveals a more personal reason for his actions, perhaps a past loss due to medical negligence or inaccessible care, making his protection of the protagonist deeply personal. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes. In that moment, the terrifying, enigmatic vampire became something more, a being who had suffered an unbearable loss, whose extreme actions were born from a pain that resonated across centuries, a pain that mirrored her own desperate fear for Finn. I saw that same desperation in your eyes at the pharmacy, Orion continued, his gaze holding hers. That same willingness to do anything to protect someone you love. I would not stand by and watch history repeat itself. Not if I had the power to prevent it. Ellie looked at him, at the ancient grief etched into his timeless features, at the immense power he wielded, a power he had used, however destructively, to protect her and her brother. Despite the dangerous path he walked, despite the darkness that clung to him, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she trusted him. "Thank you, Orion," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. It felt right. "For everything." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the profound, unconventional bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of crisis and shared vulnerability. The immediate danger had been deflected, but the path ahead was still uncertain. Yet Ellie no longer felt entirely alone. In the weeks that followed, the storm around Ellie and Orion gradually subsided, though the air never fully cleared. Detective Hanson, true to her word, pursued the lead Ellie had provided about Mr. Henderson's investors. The abandoned car of Silas Croft, along with the data chip recovered from the pharmacy, indeed pointed towards a larger, more ruthless syndicate operating out of state, specializing in counterfeit pharmaceuticals. It became a sprawling, complex case, consuming the resources of state and federal agencies. The Oakhaven Creek pharmacy fire, while still officially unsolved, became a footnote in a much larger criminal narrative, diverting the fiercest of Hanson's scrutiny away from Orion. The detective still harbored suspicions about Valerius, but her primary focus shifted to the tangible, human-led criminal enterprise. Orion, with his characteristic quiet efficiency, ensured a stable, legitimate supply of Finn's medication. He established a discreet, charitable trust, ostensibly funded by an anonymous overseas philanthropist, which covered the long-term medical expenses for Finn and a few other chronically ill children in struggling Oakhaven Creek families whose plight had come to his attention, likely through Ellie's tentative mentions. It was done with such subtlety that only Ellie knew the true source of the aid. Finn, unaware of the supernatural maelstrom that had secured his well-being, thrived. His laughter became a more frequent sound in their small apartment, his energy boundless. He was back at school, his future, once so terrifyingly fragile, now stretching before him with renewed promise. Ellie's life, too, found a new, albeit precarious, equilibrium. The threat of eviction was gone. She continued to work at the diner, Rona's gruff affection a comforting anchor to normalcy. But nothing was truly normal anymore. She carried the weight of shared secrets, of a knowledge that Oakhaven Creek was more than just a decaying river town. It was a place where ancient protectors walked in shadow, and where justice sometimes wore a terrifying face. Her relationship with Orion remained unconventional, a delicate dance of quiet understanding and unspoken truths. There were no romantic overtures, no attempts to draw her fully into his immortal, shadowed world. Instead, a profound alliance had been forged, built on mutual respect, and the shared experience of navigating a crisis that had threatened to consume them both. He was her steadfast, silent guardian, a presence she felt more than saw. Occasionally, the sleek black car would appear to take her to the rookery. They would sit in the vast library, the fire crackling, and speak, sometimes of Finn's progress, sometimes of the town's subtle shifts, and sometimes Orion would share another veiled fragment of his long existence, a melancholy observation on human nature, or a poignant memory of a world long vanished. Ellie, in turn, offered him a connection to the fleeting, vibrant pulse of ordinary life, a window into the everyday struggles and small triumphs he had long been insulated from. She understood, with a clarity that was both comforting and unsettling, that their paths were intertwined. Perhaps this was Orion's payment, as hinted at in the briefing's potential twists, not a demand, but an evolving pact. Her insight into the town, her resilience, her fundamental goodness, these were things he valued, things he might subtly call upon in his silent, ongoing war against the kinds of exploitation he so despised. She was not his subject, nor his lover in any conventional sense, but a trusted ally, a human anchor in a world that was constantly changing around his immutable existence. One cool spring evening, months after the fire, Ellie stood by Finn's bedside. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing easy and regular. The correct medication, no longer a source of terror and desperation, sat on his nightstand, a simple bottle symbolizing a hard-won peace. The air in their small apartment no longer smelled of fear, but of the faint, sweet scent of the blooming lilac bush outside their window. She walked to the window and looked out across the dark, murmuring river. On the distant bluff, the lights of the rookery glowed faintly, a cluster of steady stars against the night sky. It was a silent, watchful presence, a symbol of her newfound, precarious security. She knew that her life and Finn's had been irrevocably altered by the enigmatic millionaire vampire who resided there. The path ahead was uncertain, perhaps even dangerous, but for the first time in a very long time, Eliza Moreau felt a quiet, resilient hope. Desperate acts, she had learned, could indeed lead to the most unexpected saviors, and true justice, however flawed or terrible its methods, sometimes operated far beyond the law's often inadequate reach. And in the crucible of crisis, deep, unbreakable connections could be forged, binding a broken girl from a decaying river town to an ancient being who had found, in her fierce love for her brother, a reflection of his own timeless sorrows and a reason to continue his vigil. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe, hit the like button and comment what you thought. Pick a link on the screen for more stories.